Hello everyone! A couple weeks ago I noticed that The Little Foxes is currently streaming on Prime. I had seen it before, but for a while now, and by that I mean 3 or 4 years, I've kind of had a hankering to watch it again. So I did. The Little Foxes is a 1941 film directed by William Wyler based on a play by Lillian Hellman set in the Deep South at the turn of the century. At its center are 3 greedy siblings who let their hunger for money destroy their relationships. This is one of those instances where you watch and say, wow, these people are awful! Great movie, though! It's got an outstanding cast that includes Bette Davis, Herbert Marshall, Teresa Wright, Patricia Collins, Dan Duryea, Richard Carlson, Charles Dingle, Carl Benton Reed, and Jesse Grayson. The film was directed by William Wyler, so you can expect quality. The gowns were designed by Ori Kelly, who dressed Bette Davis in most of her films from this period, and I presume he's also the one responsible for this ghastly hat with its ominous dead bird decoration. The film was scored by Meredith Willson, who would later go on to write the 1957 hit musical The Music Man, and it was photographed by Greg Toland. Greg Toland is one of the greatest cinematographers of the Golden Age, so when I see his name in the opening titles, I'm like, oh, grab me a bib, because I'm going to be drooling all over this thing. Not really, but I feel that way. And it is indeed a fascinating film to look at, a masterclass in composition. Not that I know a whole lot about cinematography, but I can recognize when something looks really good, and the visual storytelling here is excellent. My strongest impression is how evenly balanced the images are. This makes them pleasing to the eye, but they hold narrative significance as well, emphasizing power dynamics and conflict. I noticed the frame was often dominated by 3 focal points. These were usually characters, and each character either fills a third of the frame or helps form a triangle. I was so struck by the adherence to parallel lines and triangular patterns that I tried to illustrate what I was seeing in my notes. But unfortunately, as you can see, they just ended up looking like Morse code or alien scribblings. So I don't know what to call the photographic principle at work here. Maybe someone in the comments can help me out. But Toland and Wyler used it a lot in this film, and it is part of what makes it look so great. Now, in a way, this is a grim, sordid story. The avaricious Hubbard siblings, made up of married sister Regina, bachelor Ben, and married brother Oscar, all live kitty-corner to each other and have built up a successful business making cotton. They want to take things to the next level by persuading a big city industrialist to build a mill right there in town, which would make them all filthy stinkin' rich. But first they need Regina's husband Horace to get on board with the investment, because he has more money than the rest of them. Estranged from his wife and weakened by illness, Horace is not likely to get on board with this scheme, but Regina is determined to get her way and sends their daughter Alexandra to fetch him home. Regina is aptly named, for she is really the one calling the shots. She's shrewd and calculating and image-conscious, and unlike her brothers, determined to get herself and her daughter out of the South. Bette Davis sought to interpret the role differently from how Tallulah Bankhead played it on Broadway, so she made the character more frigid and devious, adding heavy white makeup to enhance her coldness and stiffen her features. Davis had worked with Wyler twice before on Jezebel and The Letter, and they had a tendency to butt heads. Disagreements on this production became so heated that at one point Davis walked out for a few weeks. One issue was that Wyler felt Regina should be played more sympathetically, but Davis stuck to her guns, and I for one am glad that she did. I enjoy the character as a stately, intense villainess, and you have to admire her cunning and her nerve. She's more savvy than her brothers, and more savage. Not that she's without a sympathetic moment or two. I don't think she's a complete monster, at least where her daughter is concerned, and that makes her even more interesting. This is the second occasion on which Bette Davis and Herbert Marshall played a married couple. The first was a year before in Wyler's noirish adaptation of The Letter. It's a while before Marshall appears in the film, but when he does, we instantly warm to him. Horace Giddens is exhausted and unwell, with a mountain of his own serious problems. But the first thing we see him do is gently encourage his daughter to pour out her own troubles to him, and they're small potatoes compared to what he's dealing with. That interaction is all we need to understand the sharp contrast between the two parents. On a side note, I don't know how Herbert Marshall felt about this phase of his career when he got a little older and started landing father parts and father figure parts, if he lamented his shift from romantic leading man to dad material, which some would argue was a downgrade, but I, for one, find him much more appealing in these kinds of roles than in some of his earlier pre-code stuff. I don't know what you want to do with that information, but I just thought I'd throw it out there. Marshall is an expressive actor with words and without them, and using the smallest of movements and subtlest of intonations, he's able to convey that he's had it up to here with his wife and her family. The exception is his sister-in-law Bette, to whom he is kind where the others only have disdain. Oscar's wife Bette was played by Patricia Collinge, who, along with Duryea Dingle and Reed, reprised her role from the stage play. This performance was actually her film debut, for which she earned an Academy Award nomination. Clashing with the nouveau riche upstarts who have climbed the ladder of wealth by cheating the poor, Bette is the Southern aristocrat, a relic of old days who was once viewed as a valuable acquisition and is now just an annoyance, a nervous chatterbox with a drinking problem and a tendency to embarrass her family. Bette is railroaded, humiliated, and even abused, making her tragic, lonely figure one of the main casualties of the Hubbard greed machine. Another actress making a successful debut is Teresa Wright. Wright's in her early 20s here, only about 10 years younger than Bette Davis, who plays her mother. Incidentally, Patricia Collinge, who in this instance plays Wright's aunt, would play her mother 2 years later in Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt. I've always liked Teresa Wright. She's a favorite and she never disappoints. Like Bette Davis, she enjoyed a fruitful partnership with William Wyler, who directed her again in Mrs. Miniver and The Best Years of Our Lives, and she's as wonderful as ever here. For her character, this is more of a coming-of-age story, a gradual loss of innocence that leads her to come into her own, with considerable prodding from her father, her aunt, and Richard Carlson's character, a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed newspaperman who was added for the film version. He dislikes the family but likes the girl, and encourages her to learn about the world and open her eyes to how things really are. I think it's another of the movie's strengths that its junior cast is as good as its senior cast, and it's largely thanks to Wright's and Carlson's characters that the film isn't as dreary as it could have been. I know it sounds like it's just about awful, greedy people doing terrible things, which is not really my idea of a good time, but touches of comedy and sweetness that they introduce help counteract the avarice and bitterness. There's one scene where a group assembles for a little tea party, and it's like, oh, here we have all the good, likable people together, free from their oppressors for one brief, happy moment. Meanwhile, everyone else is jockeying for the most detestable character award, and it's hard to say who's winning. Ben is slick with a smarmy grin that borders on creepy, Oscar is cruel and single-minded, and his lazy son Leo is a heel. It's only Dan Duryea's second film appearance, but he's already doing his thing. With Dan Duryea, though, I always feel compelled to mention that even though he played so many yucky characters, from what I've heard, he was the nicest person in real life, a family man who was active in his community. He was just really, really good at playing scumbags in the movies. But as far as evilness goes, Regina takes the cake. Bette Davis has one particular scene, and if you've watched the movie, you know the one I mean. To discuss it, I'd have to spoil the film, and I don't want to do that, but it is the scene in the movie. It's a great, iconic moment, which reminds me of a certain part in 1945's Leave Her to Heaven. You've got a calculating woman who sees an opportunity and coolly takes advantage of it, and does something unspeakable through inaction. The Little Foxes is a bitter but not entirely hopeless tale that may not sound like a rip-roaring good time, but it's worth the watch. A good film is a good film, and I really like this one, even if its subject matter isn't the kind of thing I generally rush to see. The performances are great all across the board, it's got an atmosphere of dark glamour, and its deceptively simple material, tense domestic drama unfolding over a business venture, is handled in an artistic and compelling way that elevates it to greater significance. And those are my thoughts on The Little Foxes. I hope you enjoyed this review. If you have seen the film, I would love to hear your thoughts on it, so go ahead and share your take in the comments below, and I'll be back next week with another review. Thanks for watching.